Let's watch this.
Last year, the lady I live with, also known as my wife, asked if she could try out one of the games I've been playing. She described it as the one with the cute little ghost guy, and after scrolling through my entire library, I realized she was talking about Hollow Knight. Given the fact that her experience with video games at that point consisted of the occasional race in Mario Kart and a smattering of Crash Bandicoot levels from when she was a kid, I knew with fair confidence that her playing Hollow Knight would go terribly. So obviously I booted it up and set her into the world of Hollow Nest. As she played, every moment, regardless of how seemingly insignificant, had a strange sort of intensity to it. For example, in the tutorial there are a set of platforms that the player needs to jump across. The only penalty for falling is a little bit of time, and on my first playthrough I breezed past it and immediately forgot about it. For her, it was intense beyond belief. She wasn't sure what the penalty for falling would be, and she didn't have a full grasp on how to adjust her jump height and distance. Each successful jump felt like a triumph, and after landing,
That's a
she
weird
looked out
thought.
at the next platform, searching for the nerve to jump again. Watching her work through this early section and seeing the different ways that she viewed the game got me thinking a lot about the language of video games, and just how much a person's level of video game literacy affects their experience with any given title. I can't really
This is
think
a
of time
very
in my life
interesting
where I-
thought. Like, it's a very, very interesting idea, and you know, most of us who play video games now have been playing video games for years, and most likely started when they were very young. And I think it's very interesting when somebody has zero experience, literally zero, and they started at a later date in their life. You know, maybe they're fucking 18, 19, 20, whatever it is. And then they kind of start to experience video games in a completely different way. I don't know, it's really interesting.
I wasn't interested in games. And because of that, there are certain aspects about them that are almost instinctual to me now. And that's because a lot of games use the same ideas and vocabulary in order to get information across to players as quickly as possible. It's why the color red is almost always associated with health, why the A button or its equivalent is typically the command to jump, and why platformers more often than not have players moving from left to right. At this point, I've played enough games where after 5 minutes of trying a new one, I almost always know what to expect, no matter the kind of game. That inherent understanding
Not even.
of how games work.
I mean, most of the time you could just look at the game.
Doesn't exist for the lady I live with because she hasn't spent the time learning those things. And this made me wonder, how do people learn the basics of video games? So I decided to run an informal experiment where I'd have her play a handful of titles and see how she approached figuring each one of them out in the hopes of getting a better understanding of how people learn the language of video games. In an effort to not influence how she approached any given title,
This is
I
really
didn't give her
cool.
any advice or instructions. I just watched, silently judging. I had her play through the early sections of 9 games: Super Mario Bros., Shovel Knight, Celeste, Portal, Doom, Skyrim, The Last of Us, Uncharted 2, and so that I could really test the strength of our marriage, Dark Souls. I picked these titles because A, I felt there would be a solid sampling of 3 major types of games, those being 2D platformers, 3D platformers, and first-person shooters / adventures, while also offering a diverse spread of genres and gameplay mechanics, and B, I like them. So this is how it went.
This is really cool. This is a really good video. Like,
Just kidding, we're
I don't know why I set up like that, but this is a really good video. Discovering the
With each
basics.
game, I noticed that there were a vast amount of seemingly basic functions and mechanics that she either didn't fully grasp or know existed. This first came up with Mario 1-1. She figured out the jump easily enough, but never realized she had the ability to dash, making her time with the level painfully hard to watch. There are no in-game instructions on how to dash or do anything else really, so players will only learn about it if they read the instruction manual, figure it out through experimentation, or have another person tell them how it works. As she didn't even know it was something she could do, she never figured it out. For me, it has become second nature to try to sprint in games, whether or not I know it's an option. I just assume it will be and guess the command will probably be the B button or its equivalent. But I only make that assumption because of years of being conditioned to make it. Figuring out the controls for all of the games, whether they were explicitly explained or implicitly taught through level design, was a challenge for her. Part of this stems from her not being all that comfortable with a controller. Anytime a game asked for her to press a certain button, she'd look down at the controller and search for it. One of the most memorable instances pieces of this came up while playing The Last of Us. Early on, there's a prompt on the screen to press L3, which she couldn't find on the controller as there is no button labeled L3. She noticed it was shaped like a circle, so she guessed it might be one of the joysticks. However, she didn't know that it meant to press down on it, so she just sort of moved back and forth until eventually figuring it out. I've certainly played games that do a better job of illustrating how L3 and R3 work, but it is kind of weird that there's pretty much a hidden button on all controllers that new players will have no reason to know exists.
That's one of the biggest or the hardest things to explain to somebody. R3 and L3.
Also which buttons were where, adding another layer of things to keep track of and making the process a little bit more overwhelming. She typically fared better with games that didn't give too much information to remember. With Dark Souls, after reading 15 or so messages explaining the controls, she said she felt like she was getting too much information too quickly. A lot of things she learned, most notably the lock-on feature, she forgot about by the time they would actually be useful. On the other side of things, with Shovel Knight, she struggled to get through a few of the early sections because she didn't understand the full scope of her abilities or how to use them, but once she did start to figure things out through experimentation, she ended up remembering the core mechanics better because she witnessed firsthand how useful they could be. So for her, giving a memorable use of a mechanic made it stick in her mind a lot clearer. Most of the games I had her play were with a controller, but I did want her to have some experience with mouse and keyboard, so I had her try a few games with a first-person perspective. I thought Portal would be the best place to start, as it doesn't call for quick reflexes, and it gives players time to figure things out. Using the keyboard actually proved to be easier for her than the controller, as she uses a keyboard every day and knows where everything is. However, if you've been paying attention to the footage, you've probably noticed that she isn't looking around at all. And that's because she didn't realize she was supposed to use the mouse.
Okay.
In fairness, the instructions at the start explain how to move and how to pick things up, but they do assume that players will just know to use the mouse to look around. Given that she doesn't spend her free time watching me play games on my computer, why would she? I know that a lot of these little issues she ran into,
I guess, okay, fair,
mechanics all seem easy to overcome, and in a lot of ways they are, but they do still act as small barriers to entry for new players. Even when games have detailed explanations for things, it can sometimes be information overload, and it isn't uncommon for people to skip over explanations accidentally or on purpose because they don't feel like reading a bunch of stuff when they just want to beat the shit out of something. A lot of
I do that all the time. I don't care. I don't fucking read. I'll figure it out.
With controls, so some of the more simple explanations are kind of just left out. And I think the way most people end up learning these basic things that they won't figure out without searching on their own is through other people. For example, back to Mario. I don't remember how I learned to sprint in the game, but as I know I would not have read the instruction manual, there's a pretty decent chance that my brother told me how to do it, and I wouldn't be surprised if one of his friends had told him, and so on and so on. Also, the only reason I understand half the things I do in Dark Souls is because I've scoured wikis and message boards on how to get good. Video games are best when they are a communal experience, and a big part of that stems from the sharing of knowledge. Obviously, someone being a backseat gamer can get annoying if they explain how to do everything, but getting assistance when it's needed most can make a game far more enjoyable.
There's an obvious difference, right?
To already know and what they
like nobody wants to be told how to play the game. Nobody wants to be like, oh, dude, you have to do this, do this, do that, do this, do this, do that, do this, do this, do that. Because we don't like playing games with the fucking voice direction off or like on. Like I remember Minecraft Dungeons, actually a weird example. A lot of the time it has a menu narration, and sometimes you'll start up the game and it's just on until you actually load into a character. That is the most annoying shit because it rereads everything that you've already read in 2 seconds. Like, and I don't want somebody being that the whole time. Nobody does. So, but, you know, if I'm stuck, I also don't want to spend 20 minutes scouring information. If I know somebody knows the answer, I can just be like, hey, by the way, how do I do this? There's a difference, right? Obviously.
Actually do know. Most of the frustration that the lady I live with had while playing boiled down to not being able to figure things out that she didn't know existed, which is something that would have been solved had I not just been a silent observer. Given that I was, though, she found herself continuing to have problems, and one of those is summed up best by her most frequently asked question. When it came to the
That's
2D
funny. Yeah, how do you know where you're going, right?
Difficult for her. Because the options were
That's
limited, it
funny.
was pretty easy for her to figure out that she needed to go right and sometimes up. Celeste and Shovel Knight do have a few
Yeah,
optional
there you
rooms
go.
players can go in, but for the most part, whenever she entered one, she could tell it wasn't the path she wanted to take.
Same with
Although
Portal,
Shovel Knight
right?
does
Should
have
be
a side
pretty
room
easy.
in the tutorial that heads to the right and seems like the main path despite not being it, and there was a fair amount of disappointment as she realized she did all that work for nothing.
Are you
No, there's
fucking kidding
a
me?
scroll. It's a
However,
music
for all
note.
the 3D games, navigating
That's
proved
not
far
nothing.
more difficult. She spent a lot of time wrestling with the camera in third-person games, and she wasn't all that great at moving and looking around at the same time in first-person ones.
This is so
Due to her
funny to
not
watch.
rotating the camera around
I
a
love
ton, she
watching
didn't
new
always get a
players
great
play
sense of her
games. It's so
surroundings,
funny,
so
man.
she struggled with figuring out
It's
where
so
she
funny.
was and where she was
Like,
going.
what are you
Like
doing?
in Skyrim, she missed the jump from the tower to the house during the tutorial, and it took a while for her to realize that she had fallen
Oh
back
my
to the
God.
spot where she started. Also, because she wasn't good at
Yeah, 'cause
focusing
she's
the
not
camera,
turning the
she didn't
camera.
realize she was supposed to be following Hadvar, so she was sort of just strolling along, trying to get out of the city in her own way. Once she did follow him and got into
She'll
the
find
building,
it.
she was more interested
See?
in picking up everything she saw instead of moving forward, which actually is fair in how most people play Skyrim.
I was gonna
Either
say,
way,
that's how you
she
play
wasn't
Skyrim,
fully
so what
sure
do
where
you-
to go. Interestingly, after
What are you
we
talking
finished all
about?
the games, I brought up the footage of Skyrim and showed her the compass at the top of the screen.
And
she
you
said
put
that she
pots on
hadn't
people's head.
noticed it while playing, as she was mostly just focused on what was directly in front of her. The same thing happened with Doom's compass and even the health bars
Well,
of
that's,
enemies
like,
and bosses in Dark
invisible.
Souls. She
Wait,
typically
what?
noticed waypoints on the screen when they showed up, but she didn't know what they were.
Okay, that's different. So, Skyrim, very visible. How do you really miss that? Let me go back here. Doom? Oh. Doom, like, look at that. It's pretty hard to
But she
miss.
didn't know what they were for, so she
But a boss health bar. I mean, you go into a room. I don't even know where the fucking thing is. Anyways,
often
you go into a room. There's a giant dude, and it literally pops up as soon as you go in the room. I don't know.
Players are hit with a lot of information when they play games, and for ones who aren't
Yeah.
always comfortable with the basics, a lot of that information's pushed to the side, acting as another barrier
Shanked.
for entry. Another thing that confused her was when progression in a level wasn't entirely linear. Like with Dark Souls, she got confused when the level looped back around on itself, and she made the
Oh.
assumption that she had messed up and gone the wrong way.
Fair.
Most of the games she had played before Dark Souls had typical progression, so finding herself back near where she started felt odd. Even the 3D games that seemed like they might be more straightforward had a few things that ended up being confusing for her. For example, in Uncharted 2, what a player can climb is indicated by being colored yellow, but that wasn't obvious to her, so she constantly tried to
Okay.
climb things that just looked like they could be climbed. And then she questioned why she had to take the longer, more roundabout path when there were perfectly good handholds right above her. A similar issue with signaling happened with The Last of Us
guess.
as well. There's a part where the player has to run through a city.
That's
to
so
escape,
weird. It's
and
such a
gas
weird
station
thought to know that, like, little things like that, red barrels, yellow markings, or whatever you want to call it, all that stuff, like, it's so second nature, but not to everybody. Like, not to somebody who doesn't play games. They don't know what the fuck it means. It's
explodes,
yellow.
causing street
Cool,
lamps
it's
and
a
other
color.
things to block the road ahead. My wife noticed
But
a
we
little
can
gap
see
on the
it so
sidewalk that
easily.
was untouched by fire, so she kept trying to run through that to get out. But every time she did, the infected came and killed her. This made her think
Oh.
that the issue wasn't with it being the wrong way to go, but rather with her not being fast enough. So she kept trying
Smart.
that same path over and over before finally finding the right way. With
Well, that's
game
'cause she's
design,
not
there's often a
turning.
battle between
She might have
having a
seen
level
down the
look
street.
realistic and making it easy to
Knowing,
navigate.
like, okay,
In
I'll go
this
that way.
example, Naughty Dog tried to make the city feel more natural by not
Like
having
that.
every path be physically blocked off. And while more experienced players will most likely see the explosion and assume they should go a different way, the game falls short on helping players who
Yeah, I
don't
guess.
understand what they're supposed to do. By having the signal be the explosion,
But, like,
and
yeah,
the
let's run
consequence being
towards
an
the
attack by the
zombies.
infected,
Even
she
still.
learned the wrong lesson. And this sort of thing ended up happening to her a fair amount throughout the process, even with things that had nothing
So
to
funny
do
to
with
watch. I love this.
navigation. Sometimes she just interpreted the information the game was giving her in the wrong way, and she found herself.
Learning the wrong lessons. Okay.
The idea that some games teach players how to play simply through gameplay and level design is a pretty common talking point in the video game community. I'm a firm
Yeah.
believer that a lot of games do this, and watching her play reaffirmed that thought. For example, in Doom, her initial instinct was to stay as far away from enemies as possible because she didn't feel all that comfortable with the controls of a first-person shooter. However, once she came across enemies who threw fireballs at her from a distance that did way more damage than anything she could do from that same range, she started to realize that her best bet was to get close to enemies and either beat the crap out of them or use the shotgun. Ultimately, Doom is meant to be played this way. The glory kill system,
get in their face, punch them, chainsaw them, beat the shit out of them. That's how you do it. Throw the barrel at them.
And having one
I don't
of the
think you
first
can throw
rooms
it,
be
but still.
extremely difficult to beat without playing this way
just beat 'em
sets
up.
the expectation for the rest of the game. It took her a fair bit of banging her head against the wall to get past this room.
No, that's
but
punching
once
the
she
wall.
did,
Okay.
she was better at the core mechanics of the game than when she started. With that said, what I found even more interesting than when she learned the right lessons of how to play a game through gameplay was when she learned the wrong ones. The first instance of this that I noticed happened while playing Mario 1-1. At the beginning of the level, there's a question mark box with a mushroom in it. She had some familiarity with the Mario franchise, so she knew that mushrooms were good to get. However, after hitting the box, she jumped into a different block, causing the mushroom to change directions and go off the left side of the screen, out of reach. She didn't register that she had caused the mushroom to change directions, leading her to the assumption that mushrooms would always end up going to the left. When she got to another block that she suspected held the mushroom, she hit it and immediately moved to the left to grab it before it went off screen, and, well... This was a far less intrusive lesson to get wrong than the ones that came up while she played Celeste and Shovel Knight.
That's so funny, man. That is so funny.
With the player learning how to dash, which is arguably the most important and useful mechanic in the game. The lady I live with interpreted the prompt to mean that the only way to dash was by doing it at an upward angle, pretty much crippling her ability to do screens effectively until after 15 minutes or so when she accidentally dashed horizontally and realized her moveset was wider than she had thought. With Shovel Knight, early on, she died
Look at this!
And realized her move
she just respawned.
Was wider than she had thought.
Oh god. That's so funny. I love watching newer people. It's the best.
On her next time through, she jumped on the bubble and the bag at the same time and assumed that both things had damaged her, causing her to think that the bags of gold were an enemy of some sort. So when she came across them after that, she would either try to attack them or actively avoid them. As she wasn't paying terribly close attention to the HUD, she never realized what they actually did. I'm not saying that these things are the faults of the game developers, but it is interesting how easily information on screen can be misunderstood.
Yeah, that is interesting.
Can happen to players of all skill levels, but given her lack of experience, she didn't have much else to go on to challenge the lessons she thought she had learned. I found the disconnect between how she thought games worked and how they actually worked to be pretty intriguing. And as I focused more on those differences, I started to notice a sort of trend with every title she played. That being...
thinking games would be cooler.
When most people talk about what any video game is like, there's often a greater focus on the general actions players can do rather than the limitations that make it possible for the game to function. For example, Mass Effect could be described as a role-playing game where, among other things, players get the opportunity to talk to and form relationships with various characters across the universe. People who play a lot of games will most likely go in understanding that this actually means players will be able to form relationships with a predetermined cast of characters by choosing responses from a set of limited dialogue options. As it turns out, this formula makes for a really great series, but there is a gap between what a game sounds like and what it actually looks like. And I think for people who don't end up playing a lot of games,
where does this come into play in this circumstance?
Partners talk about them. They get a warped perception about what players can do in a title because they don't understand or know the systems that games use in order to give these grand-sounding experiences. What I know to apply a sort of video game logic to any title I play, the lady I live with was always trying to apply real-world logic. Like in the Doom tutorial, there's a gore nest that the player needs to destroy. A waypoint marker shows up on it, which when I first played, I knew meant I needed to go up to it and most likely hit a button prompt. When my wife played, she didn't know what the marker meant, so her initial instinct wasn't to walk right up to it. Instead, she noticed while messing around that the red barrels exploded, so she had the idea to try to push one of the barrels towards the nest to blow it up. And this is objectively more interesting than just pressing a button to destroy it, but of course it didn't work. Throughout the various games, a pretty common question she asked
That's actually smart, though.
And my response was...
like, that's smart.
The deeper answer is that limitations exist in games because there are only so many potential inputs a title can have, meaning there are a finite number of ways a player can interact with things. If developers tried to program in every possible way a player might think about interacting with something, games would just never come out. I'm used to these limitations. I actually appreciate them in a lot of instances. However, for her,
What game
she
is
got
that?
frustrated when the ideas she came up with didn't work. Like
That
while
game looked
scaling
cool.
the train in Uncharted 2, she reached a point where she wanted to swing from a pipe and through a window. So when she realized she had to take the predetermined path that didn't take much more than pressing
That would
left,
be
she
sick.
felt disappointed because, yeah, her idea was cooler. In Skyrim,
Yeah.
as Alduin began attacking the city, she found a spot in a house and figured she'd just wait it out until he left. But due to the scripted nature of this part of the game, that plan didn't work,
No.
forcing her to follow the path the game wanted her to follow. In turn, this took away all the tension of this section because she knew she could take as long as she wanted and nothing bad would happen. Hiding in a house isn't that fun of a way
Fair.
to play a game, but her not being able to made it feel like she lost some agency. Her expectations for what she thought she could do in each game were always different than the reality, and I think as she realized that games were more simple than she had first assumed, some of the intrigue about them faded.
Yeah. The end of it. Oh god.
For the lady I live with, the thing she hated more than anything else about this
I
experience
love how he
was
says that.
having
The
to
lady I
replay
live
sections
with.
of a level over and over again after dying. Had I not told her to keep
It's his
trying
wife.
on a handful of the games, she would have stopped far sooner because it was understandably frustrating. With that said, when she did stick with games that frustrated her and ended up beating the
That's
parts that
all she is. I
struggled
just live with her.
she found it exhilarating.
Hey, my
I think
wife.
this trade-off of dealing with frustration so that the excitement of beating something is all that much sweeter is one that people who play a lot of games not only understand but look for. However, trying to pitch that she should spend her free time doing something that actively frustrates her so that the few moments where she succeeds feel glorious is a bit of a tough look. This little test has me questioning how I became interested in video games in the first place. I don't remember how they became such a big part of my life. I don't know how I got to the point where I could look at a compass at the top of a screen and know what to expect from every marker without looking them up. I don't know how I first learned about stamina bars and the various ways to make sure I don't run out of energy. I don't know how I became, I guess, fluent in the language of video games. I'm just glad that I learned the basics when I was young enough to not care about spending hours on one level. For a better understanding of how inexperienced players approach video games, I need to run a much wider and more complex study that tests in a more robust way than just sitting down to watch my wife play video games a few times. But I did find it interesting to compare
this is
how
actually a really
wildly
good
different
video.
my
Really
approach to games
good
is to
video.
hers.
Really good
And
idea
while
in
I
general.
definitely don't have enough definitive information to make any sort of legitimate conclusion about how inexperienced players approach games, I do want to say this. In a similar way to how it is harder to learn a language as an adult, it's harder to get into video games after a lifetime of not playing them. And from what I've seen, that seems to have less to do with interest and more to do with struggling to get over the barriers that exist for new players. Like, if you don't know how to read, why would you pick up a book? What I'm getting at is if someone you know who doesn't play games expresses interest in trying one, don't force them to be in an experiment where you give no guidance and mostly just watch them struggle with something that they never learned how to do. Teach them how to read it instead.
Yeah.
And now you have a very not annoying at all item. That if you hit, that's it. Yep.
This wasn't one of the games.
Fucking get it!
You can use that to like wake things up and you can break stuff.
Ooh.
Oh, so this is him actually explaining a game to her a little bit.
Don't put that in the video.
Okay. Yeah, man, this is a really good video. If you haven't seen it, check it out. He's got a fucking ton of subscribers. Most people have probably seen it, but yeah, man. Good video. And just the thought, you know. The thought of somebody coming into games at a later date and it almost ruining games for them in a sense. It's a very weird thing because yeah, as a kid, you don't really care. You don't have a need to do anything else. You know, your mom might yell at you about fucking doing dishes or this, that, or the other thing. But other than that, you don't have a need for anything. You don't have any responsibilities. You don't have, you know, a job, bills, nothing. And so you could spend hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, days and years of your life as a young kid playing games, even the same game, you know. You would never know that just because I played it as a kid made me able to play it as an adult without seeing, you know, like kind of firsthand. I mean, I've seen it a couple times. People sit down, they pick up a game or whatever, they hate it. They don't like playing games. It's too frustrating. They don't know what's going on. It's whatever. And I've also seen it where, people get really interested. They see me playing a game, it looks super cool and easy and this and that, and they want to play it, and then they play it and they do shit, and they're like, what the fuck? Like, what's going on? Sometimes they want to do better, sometimes they don't. And yeah, I think it's a really very interesting thing to even just have this idea, like, what games are like for someone who doesn't play games. You know, what if I sat down my 22-year-old best friend who's never touched a video game in their life and didn't say anything? How would they do? What would they play? You know, um, how would they play? Fucking what what little gaming tricks do I know that they will just never grasp unless they just figure it out? Just because you've, spent hours as a kid doing it. I think that's really insane. It's a really smart idea, honestly.